The book of Genesis tells the story of early humanity and the beginnings of the nation of Israel. Its account goes all the way back to the first human beings, Adam and his wife, Eve. But while we get glimpses into their lives, there is so much that it doesn't say. We are given the names of their three sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth. It tells us about their fall from grace and about the sharp escalation of human sin that grows with the first homicide and climaxes with the great flood. But Adam and Eve had other children, probably quite a few, and we are told nothing of them, their names or their stories. And that creates puzzles about the lives of the first human family. Who were these lost children of Adam and Eve, and what were their names? And how did their stories play into the larger narrative of the Bible? Some have used this lack of detail to cast doubt on the veracity of the Bible itself. Citing the ambiguities in the early chapters of Genesis, they presume that the stories are illogical and that the book of Genesis is absurd and unreliable, casting doubt on the entire Bible. But this is a fallacy. As the saying goes, with God, all things are possible. And there are certainly ways to resolve the paradoxes. This video will start with what the book of Genesis tells us, and we will use that to draw some conclusions about these earliest days of history. We will use some material from ancient Jewish traditions relating to the time between the fall of man and the great flood. And from that, we will talk about some of Adam and Eve's children, in particular, their daughters, the wives of Cain and Seth. From this, we can build a more detailed narrative and a plausible timeline of events, one that adds detail but is consistent with Genesis. This should not be mistaken for divinely inspired truth. These traditions and alternative sources do not stand on par with the Bible itself, but they can help us understand the early chapters of the book of Genesis. The early chapters of Genesis tell us that God created the world and the first man, Adam, in 6 days. Later on, God took a rib from Adam and used that to create a wife, who would be called Eve. They are placed in the Garden of Eden, where they tend to all the plants and animals. There was a tree in the Garden of Eden whose fruit they were commanded not to eat. We are told that a serpent coaxes Eve into eating some of that forbidden fruit, and that Eve in turn offers the fruit to Adam, who eats some of it as well. Suddenly, they realize they are naked and feel shame. And with that, Adam and Eve fall away from God. God curses the pair and the serpent, though he also hints at a redeemer who will eventually defeat the serpent. Driven from Eden, Adam and Eve begin having sexual relations, and Eve has her first son, Cain, and a second son, Abel. Cain grows up to be a farmer, tilling the soil, while Abel becomes a shepherd. The two offer sacrifices to God. Abel's sacrifice of some of the firstborn from his flock is accepted, but Cain's sacrifice of fruits is rejected. Out of jealousy, Cain attacks Abel and kills him. Cain is cursed, but God spares his life. He is given a mark or a sign to ensure that nobody avenges Abel's death. His career as a farmer is over. His crops are destined to fail. He is doomed to live as a wanderer. Eventually, he finds a wife and settles in the land of Nod. There, he establishes a city called Enoch, named for his first son. Adam and Eve have another son, named Seth. We are told that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters as well. One of the most remarkable aspects of the early chapters of Genesis is how long the first men lived. Adam died at 930. Seth would live for 912. Most of the men whom we are told about lived past 900 years. This state of affairs lasts for several generations up to the time of Noah. The long lifespans are only one of the several striking differences between the lives of these earliest human beings and those who came later on. It wasn't just that they lived for such a long time, but they were vigorous for hundreds of years too. Noah fathered children after the age of 500, and he would be 600 when the great flood started. We aren't told how long women lived. Perhaps it was already considered rude to ask a woman her age, but it's very likely they lived extremely long lives as well. The Bible imagines a substantial human population already in existence within the lifetime of Cain. The city of Enoch that Cain founded would have been more like a medium-sized town by our standards, with maybe a few thousand inhabitants, but it still would have been a tremendous undertaking and a pointless one without a population of laborers to help him build and move in afterwards. Alongside the long lives, it seems humans were healthier and stronger in many ways. Childbirth would have been painful. That was one of the curses placed on Eve after the fall, but it doesn't seem to have been dangerous, as it would become for much of human history. In Genesis, the first woman to die during childbirth, at least that we are told about, is Rachel, the wife of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. This comes after God shortens human life to 120 years. The taboo against incest didn't exist and wouldn't be in place until much later. Abram, the forefather of the Hebrews, was allowed to marry his half-sister, Sarai, long after the flood. With families forming and dispersing over hundreds of years, marrying a close relative wouldn't necessarily have had the same emotional complications either. There are many explanations for how these conditions might have come about. Perhaps human genetics were more robust, with less risk of birth defects and health problems that are associated with inbreeding, and the relative lack of pollution contributed to longer lifespan. We aren't told of any plagues either, so it's possible there were fewer harmful viruses. In Genesis, we're told after the stories of Cain, Abel, and Seth that Adam had other sons and daughters. The placement of this explanation near the end of Adam's life might lead one to assume that these three sons were Adam's first three children, and that his other offspring came later on. But that's likely a misreading. There is little reason to think that there weren't other children born between the births of Cain, Abel, and Seth. Most scholars have suggested that some of Adam's descendants could have been mated with prehistoric humans. However, this would contradict the Bible's statement that no suitable spouse for Adam was to be found before the creation of Eve. It's also conceivable that God created other humans aside from Adam and Eve. One ancient story suggests that there was another woman named Lilith, created at the same time as Adam. Supposedly, she refused to submit to Adam as his wife and was expelled from Eden. Later on, she could have had children and provided another family that would have contributed to a larger human population, but the Bible doesn't even hint at anyone like Lilith. Neither of these explanations is necessary. The long, vigorous lifespans would have allowed for the rapid expansion of human population and the start of many families during the lifetimes of Cain and Seth. They would not have lacked potential mates. Ancient Jewish traditions, collected in the Talmud and extra-canonical works such as the Book of Jubilees, can also help us understand the complications that arise from the first chapters of Genesis. One should be careful about taking these books too literally. Most Christian churches and schools of Jewish thought do not consider them authoritative to the same extent that the 39 books of the Old Testament are. Much of the material is speculative, sometimes even fanciful. But some of this material might have been accurate, passed down through the generations until they were collected and written down. At a minimum, they can show us how the ancient Jews understood the lives of Adam and his son. Since the stories in Genesis were written in their native language and were part of their tradition long before Christians adapted them, it can be helpful to understand how the Hebrews imagined things played out. The ancient Hebrews believed that Adam and Eve had daughters along with Cain and Abel. Abel might have been the second child named in Genesis, but he was not the second born. The Genesis Rabbah says that Cain was born with a twin sister, and that Abel was part of a set of triplets, a boy and two girls. Initially, it seems that each of the boys was expected to marry their twin, but perhaps Cain wanted one of the two sisters born later on with Abel. This dispute could have made Cain's jealousy more acute after his sacrifice was rejected and might have been what spurred Cain to commit murder. The Bible doesn't tell us what the mark was that ensured Cain's life was spared, and the Genesis Rabbah doesn't give us a definite answer either. Most ancient rabbis thought it was a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, but it wasn't necessarily a visible marking either. It could have been an outward sign of protection. One interesting interpretation was that a dog grew attached to Cain. This would have been a unique signal and very practical. Having a guard dog at his side would have made it much more difficult for anyone to sneak up on Cain. The Genesis Rabbah is quite clear that Adam and Eve had other children. One tradition has it that Eve gave birth to 9 other sons, and probably a comparable number of daughters. This sets up a neat parallel with the 12 sons of Jacob, who became the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. There is an even more detailed account in the Book of Jubilees. Jubilees was written before the time of Christ by an unknown Jewish priest. Much of the Hebrew version has been lost, but a complete translation into ancient Ethiopian has been preserved. Although most Christians and Jewish groups consider Jubilees apocryphal, churches and synagogues in Ethiopia consider it part of their canon. While its place in the canon is doubtful, the Book of Jubilees cannot be dismissed as an Ethiopian invention. The ancient origin of the book was confirmed by the discovery of portions in the original Hebrew among the Dead Sea Scrolls. As far as can be determined, the Ethiopian is a faithful translation of the original Hebrew. Again, this material should be taken with a grain of salt, but at least it does give us some understanding of how the ancient Jews understood the beginning of Genesis. The Book of Jubilees is sometimes called the Little Genesis because it covers much of the same material, except that Jubilees provides more details, including a rough chronology of the events after the fall of man, and more names, including a couple of the names of a couple of Adam's daughters. According to the Book of Jubilees, Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden for about 7 years before eating the forbidden fruit and being expelled from Eden. They waited a while before starting a family. Cain would have been born 60 to 70 years after creation, and then Abel 7 years after Cain. The Book of Jubilees disagrees with the Genesis Rabbah about Cain and Abel having twin sisters, but Eve does have a daughter a few years after Abel. Her name is Awan. The name is similar to the ancient Hebrew word for vice or potency. Later sources would give this girl the name Kalmana or Luluwa. About 100 years after creation, Cain and Abel make their offerings, and animosity breaks out between the two brothers. Cain slays Abel, and God curses him. Jubilees does not tell us what the mark of Cain consists of either, but Cain would spend at least 30 years and as many as 100 before finding a home. According to the Book of Jubilees, Adam and Eve mourned the death of their son for close to 30 years, but around 130 years after creation, Eve would become pregnant and give birth to Seth. 5 to 10 years later, Eve gave birth to a second girl, Azura. Her name invokes the color of the sky, although it could also mean well-guarded. Other sources give this woman the name Balbria. At about the same time, Cain takes Awan as his wife, and she gives birth to Enoch. Around 190 years after creation, humanity begins to build the first permanent homes. And a few years after that, Cain brings work to the town that he would name after Enoch, who would have been about 50 years old at the time. About 225 to 230 years after creation, Seth marries Azura. Seth would have been close to 100 years old at the time, while his bride would have been around 90. They would have Enos a few years later. Enos would be notable for being one of the first to call upon the name of the Lord. Enoch would be the ancestor of Noah, and according to Genesis, it would be Noah along with his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, along with their wives, who would be the only survivors of the Great Flood. No doubt some of their ancestors would be relatives of Cain, but it would be Seth and his descendant Noah, who would be considered the predecessors of humanity after Adam. So those are some of the ancient traditions about the first few chapters of Genesis. We hope you found these stories interesting. Some stories in scriptures leave us full of clarity, Others, they may leave behind whispers, fragments, names not mentioned, lives not fully told. The story of Adam and Eve's forgotten children is one of those, and maybe that's the point. Because in the quiet gaps, God invites us to look closer, dig deeper, and ask, what have we overlooked? What have we assumed? And what hidden threads might still shape the tapestry of redemption? Here at Divine Mysteries, we do not aim to fill in every blank, but we do believe even the questions left unanswered carry weight. If this journey made you pause, wonder, or see Scripture with fresh eyes, pass it on, not as doctrine, but as discovery. Subscribe for more explorations into the overlooked, the obscure, and the beautifully complicated parts of the Bible. Drop your thoughts below. What do you think happened to the lost sons and daughters? Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep reading between the lines.